Good afternoon, everyone. Members of State Parliament, representatives from local government, industry partners, colleagues, students and friends. My name is Professor Rob Saint and I'm the University of Adelaide's Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research Strategy. I'd first like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains on which all four campuses of the University of Adelaide at Roseworthy, Thebarton, The Waite and here on North Terrace are built. Welcome everyone to tonight's Research Tuesday, the first for 2015. As many of you already know as seasoned Research Tuesday attendees, this is our wonderful series of free public seminars presented by leading researchers at the University of Adelaide. Now the series is in its 9th year. We have a very impressive lineup planned for 2015 with lectures exploring topics from stem cells to fossils, probably not on the same night, and with forums planned around water research and the anniversary of the Gallipoli landing. This year we'll be increasing our Research Tuesday sessions by showcasing some of our newly appointed professors who'll present their inaugural lectures. This means you'll have even more opportunity to learn about the great research that goes on here at the University of Adelaide. Tonight we turn our attention to Australia's struggling automotive manufacturing industry. With its well-publicised closure imminent, it's important that we understand the likely impact on workers, on local businesses and on our wider community. What can we do to avoid escalating unemployment and worsening hardship in some of our most disadvantaged suburbs? How do we avoid industrial heartlands being turned into potential industrial deserts? To give us an insight into this topic, tonight we have someone who needs little introduction, but I'll give him one, Associate Professor John Spoehr. John heads the University of Adelaide's Australian Workplace Innovation and Social Research Centre, known as WISER. He's one of Australia's leading socio-economic analysts and commentators, specialising in the areas of economic development and the human dimension of change. John is also leading the establishment of the Stretton Centre, a partnership between the University, the City of Playford and the South Australia and Australian governments. Would you please join me in welcoming our guest speaker for tonight, Associate Professor John Spoehr.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's fantastic to be here with such a large crowd of people today. Terrific on this beautiful day here at the University of Adelaide. It's been an extraordinary backdrop to this lecture the last couple of days. Plenty to entertain you at the national level, and I'm not sure where we're at with the submarine project. I was a bit more certain about it yesterday. Today I'm feeling decidedly uncertain about it. I'm going to touch on the submarine project in my talk today, but the main focus of my talk is talking about what the impact of the auto closure is and essentially what we might be able to do about it over the next few years to try and mitigate the impact. And I know that a lot of you are here today because you are deeply concerned about what we will do in the face of the auto closure. I have some bad news and I have some good news. Ultimately, I'm an eternal optimist, so bear with me through this talk. There might be some depressing times at which we might need to shake our heads and be uplifted by the person next to you to remind you that all is not lost. Indeed, all is not lost, but we are in for some difficult years ahead, I have to say. So it worries and saddens me that the Australian auto industry will soon close, particularly when I see high-cost manufacturing nations like the United States, the United Kingdom and Germany growing their automotive sectors. While I was in Birmingham recently visiting the Rover MG manufacturing site at Longbridge, which was closed back in 2005, a new company that came out of the ashes, a sort of Phoenix auto company, Jaguar Land Rover, announced they were recruiting 1,300 new workers to build a new 5-seat Jaguar sports car at their Solihull factory. The CEO of Jaguar Land Rover, Ralph Speth, said at the time, "Today's announcement once again demonstrates our commitment to the UK and the advancement of a high-tech, high-skilled manufacturing-led economy." Now, these are words that many of us would have liked to have heard here in Australia last year from our CEOs of auto companies. But unfortunately, that was not to be. And so our title this evening, Far from the Car, reflects the automotive industry's past and present, both nationally and locally, to South Australia, as one of our, if not most significant, integrated manufacturing value chains, upon which a myriad of other businesses and households depend. But Far from the Car is also emblematic of the already realised fact that swathes of other manufacturing enterprises have been permanently lost over the past half-decade, and of the real and present danger, unfortunately, of wholesale deindustrialisation in the future. In simple terms, what I mean by this is the emergence of a cycle of self-reinforcing decline, one that flows from the loss of critical manufacturing capabilities, knowledge and skills, and potentially undermines our ability to compete effectively in the global knowledge economy. Both the South Australian and national economies are at a crossroad. The impending closure of GMH, and indeed the entire national auto industry, is the most dramatic of several unmistakable pointers to the acute danger of deindustrialisation and consequently the de-skilling of the Australian economy. Whether the current crop of national political leaders and decision makers is capable of recognising it or not, South Australia, and for that matter Victoria's economic problems and vulnerabilities are in fact those of the whole nation, and they are ignored at our peril. There is in particular precious little appreciation from Canberra of the economy-wide impacts either of the resources boom or of the nation's position now that the boom's construction and investment phases are over. The reality is that we're facing years of below-trend growth. It's generally known that the dizzying rise in the exchange rate and accompanying higher costs fuelled by the mining boom placed extraordinary competitive pressure on other trade-exposed sectors such as manufacturing. But what is only now beginning to be appreciated is that the contraction of the resources sector and return to a lower dollar will not lead to the compensating higher investment in other sectors that the South Australian and Australian economies have seen in the past. The reason? The boom and its aftermath have seen the accelerated demise of many large-scale intensive industries, as well as smaller export-oriented firms. With a gradual return to a more competitive exchange rate, we are not seeing the previous compensating positive stimulus to these sectors because of the massive disinvestment decisions by major companies in the recent past. The installed capacity of these industries no longer resides in Australia. It's gone forever. The automotive industry needed an exchange rate of about 80 cents to be competitive. The exchange rate is now below that level, and that's somewhat ironic, I think. But neither the internationally mobile capital and capacity of the auto industry nor of several other industries will ever be returning to Australia on the scale of the past. Whatever have been the benefits of the resources boom, Australia's handling of it has reduced the competitiveness and size of much of the nation's tradable goods and services sector and the diversity of our economy. My view is that without targeted action to retain, transform and diversify our manufacturing, Australia faces the permanent loss of essential economic capabilities. And with that, let me stress, reduced capacity to develop new ones in the future. The consequences of this would include dependence on fewer and lower value-adding industries, greater vulnerability to external shocks as a consequence, and a weaker, more narrowly based and exposed Australian economy, with unacceptable transition costs on the Australian society as a whole and on particular vulnerable regions where manufacturing is concentrated. I want to talk about why, and just as importantly, how we must intervene to retain critical manufacturing capabilities in Australia and South Australia. Contrary to those who say manufacturing is part of the old economy, an old economy that we can do without, or even that we are better off without it. I say it is their thinking and not manufacturing which is antiquated. If you want to be part of the global economy, manufacturing is mandatory, not optional. So our first question is, what is manufacturing? Throughout its history, manufacturing has always meant, quite simply, making things. And this needs to be our starting point, even today. And instead of thinking of manufacturing as discrete products or processes, it's far more useful to view manufacturing as an ever-expanding range of capabilities, from its origin in handicrafts through to mass production and Fordism of the past to today's mass customisation and flexible production. The one constant of manufacturing has been change. Too many people think of manufacturing as synonymous with industries such as cars or steel, much as Victorian English people might have equated it with cotton production or iron founding. That missed the point that manufacturing is complex, evolving and dynamic. It means different things at different points in history. Today, manufacturing covers an unprecedented, vast array of products and technologies with unprecedented diversity and sophistication. Today, complex manufacturing is far from a discrete physical activity, but it encompasses complex value chains involving research, through to design and development, production, operations, maintenance, through to environmentally sustainable disposal and recycling of the manufactured product at the end of its productive life cycle. Manufacturing is the key to a nation or region's ability to participate in the global knowledge economy. As the Harvard researchers Hidalgo and Hausman argue in their path-breaking book, The Atlas of Complexity, Mapping Paths to Prosperity, manufacturing is the intense application of knowledge to making things. It's what drives higher levels of economic complexity. And they show the difference in nations' economic performance and, critically, their prosperity depend on their level of economic complexity. In advanced economies, manufacturing is central to driving productivity and innovation, and it's the biggest spender on research and development and knowledge-intensive services, a fact that I think is little known or little understood. Manufacturing generates spillover effects across the economy through its research and development intensity, and involvement in developing future platforms or so-called key enabling technologies such as nanotechnology, photonics, advanced materials and so on. These are platforms today which are keys to future competitive advantage. Manufacturing is the largest component of world trade, and because its strong linkages to mining, agriculture and services, it's a vital driver of employment across the whole economy. In fact, manufacturing transforms other industries. Think of agriculture and food processing, or agriculture and chemical production. Think of forestry and new technologies to develop cross-laminated timbers. Think of the application of new manufacturing technology to healthcare, and so on and so on. There are many examples in the modern sophisticated economy of manufacturing crossing boundaries. There are no strict boundaries between manufacturing and services anymore. The so-called servitization of manufacturing is the process by which manufacturers use service offerings to build competitive advantage, sales and revenues. Through servitization, services become entwined with manufacturing, with the manufacturing value chain, building value to the customer by going beyond offering a single transaction involving a discrete product to a longer-term relationship geared to meeting evolving customer needs. The lines between manufacturing and services are blurred. Up to 50% of workers in the manufacturing sector in key OECD economies are in service-related occupations. The amount of services in manufacturing was estimated to be 25 to 30% of total output in certain OECD countries 20 years ago, and it could be expected to be higher today. The evidence is also that in advanced economies, a dynamic manufacturing sector underpins higher net incomes and employment than would otherwise be the case. I would argue that in doing so, it also supports greater social inclusion and cohesion. It makes for a fairer society. It makes for higher living standards. Declining direct manufacturing employment levels is a phenomenon that's common to all OECD countries. It doesn't spell the end of manufacturing. It's not evidence that of the reduced importance of manufacturing to advanced economies. In successful OECD economies, manufacturing's share of overall value added, or GDP, has either been maintained or declined by a much lesser proportion than employment. And that reflects the significant productivity gains that have been achieved in manufacturing over recent years as a result of automation, introduction of robotics and so on, new work methods. And to that fact, that many of the sophisticated services jobs in such economies are actually manufacturing dependent. They rely on having a strong manufacturing sector nearby. And you can see why looking only at numbers or percentages directly employed in manufacturing can be so misleading. Rather than services employment being seen as an alternative to manufacturing, as it's often presented, it is closer to the truth to say that high-end service occupations are to be found in association with the activity of making things, that is, with a strong presence of manufacturing. The most relevant measure for a country is the share of manufacturing in its GDP. The successful countries of which I speak, Germany, Singapore, Switzerland and Taiwan, typically had a manufacturing share of GDP of around 20% in 2013. And even that high figure probably understates manufacturing's role in these two main reasons. First, because of the interweaving of manufacturing and services that is so much a feature of advanced economies. And second, because the changes in manufacturing in these countries is often ahead of what is captured in the categories of the official statistics. These countries are not deindustrialising, but instead defending their GDP shares of manufacturing. Contrast Australia. Between 2008, the year of the global financial crisis, and 2013, manufacturing's share of Australian GDP fell from an already low 12% to 7%. I now turn to the questions: what does losing the auto industry mean to South Australia and to the nation? And what do we lose when we lose complex automotive manufacturing? And what are the consequences, furthermore, of this? Much more is lost from the demise of the auto industry than merely the ability to manufacture, engineer and build cars. Automotive has been and has to a large extent remained Australia's most developed, integrated and complex value chain. Despite the progressive lowering of local content in Australian production over the last decade. Some of the enabling competencies and technologies inherent in auto manufacturing and engineering include systems integration, materials science and engineering, process engineering, automation and control technologies, electronics and miniaturisation, digital content and on and on and on, through to injection moulding. These are vital competencies that can and are built in automotive manufacturing and then applied across other critical endeavours such as defence, medical and assistive technologies, food production, machine tools, mining and resource technologies, and so on and on. Today, our objective should be to identify and maximise applications for these capabilities outside of the automotive sector, in high growth, local and global value chains, in new manufacturing and related services. It's true that over the past decade or so, Australia has been on a treadmill of producing cars with progressively fewer Australian workers and lower Australian manufacturing content, at the cost of some not inconsiderable public budgetary assistance, which was the focus of enormous debate last year. Over that period, we went from producing around 400,000 units a year to around half that number, underlying one of the critical problems that the Australian industry faced. That's not to say that assistance was unjustified, far from it, but it needed to target actively and progressively build and transition manufacturing capacity and capabilities to opportunities outside automotive, as well as sustaining, for a time, automotive production itself. Recall, however, that it's possible to manufacture cars in high-cost nations. Arguably, we've chosen not to. Assistance should not have been seen as just about building cars, but also about providing time to gather and hold within Australia the key capabilities auto manufacturing has imparted to us. It is then a question of applying these capabilities to new manufacturing opportunities, because the alternative is losing these capabilities forever, and they're very difficult to get back. Until last year, many of us with that perspective hoped we could buy half a dozen or so years to work on the transition. Now, unfortunately, we have less than a third of that time, and possibly even less if things go pear-shaped. In other words, the policy framework we should have had and now need desperately is one about diversification and accelerated movement into new manufacturing and related services. What are the local, statewide and national impacts of the automotive closure? Well, my organisation commissioned national economics last year to model the impact of the closure of the auto industry, and we worked with the state government on similar modelling. And national economics estimated the aggregate impact to be a net loss of just over 200,000 jobs nationally against the baseline scenario that we had to 2018. Around 100,000 jobs are lost from the Victorian economy, while South Australia loses around 24,000 jobs. So those employed at GMH are really the tip of the automotive industry iceberg. Just to remind you, 1,700 workers at GMH at the moment. The balance of jobs lost is shared amongst other states less dependent on automotive production, although New South Wales are also hit significantly. These figures represent the losses viewed as the total of jobs lost and jobs not created as a result of the closure. The rate of job growth for the two automotive states is effectively halved over the forecast period. The effect on national GDP is the permanent loss of $29 billion. The basic reason for the largeness of the impact is the fact that the automotive sector is a complex manufacturing sector involving complex supply chains and interdependencies. Around about 700 companies just here in South Australia alone depend on the existence of GMH in some form or another. The impacts therefore go well beyond the direct jobs lost and the usual second, third and fourth round multiplier effects that are used in modelling. But this is the baseline scenario. The exchange rate is the fundamental determinant of what might unfold. A greater than baseline fall in the exchange rate to around 65 cents and sustained at that level to around about 2024 increases the economic losses from the auto closure. And of course, we have seen the exchange rate come down as most of us expected that it would, and it may well come down quite a lot if the global economy remains shaky over years to come. Because of this lower exchange rate, the industry would have been sustained at higher levels of activity than the baseline. The losses here rise to around about 270,000 fewer jobs and around about a $44 billion GDP loss to the national economy. Beyond these overall aggregate impacts, the temporal and spatial dimensions are of great importance, and we managed to model these with the assistance of national economics by local government area. And much of this you'll find on our website, including detailed spreadsheets if you love the numbers. Of all LGAs in Australia, Playford in northern Adelaide, home to the GMH assembly plant, is projected to suffer the greatest adverse impact in percentage employment change by location of work at the 16th quarter, that is after 4 years. And that amounts to around about a 15.8% decline in employment. So for every 6 employees in the area, 1 will no longer be employed 4 years after the closure. As you'd appreciate, Playford cannot afford these sorts of losses. It's the most disadvantaged LGA in Greater Adelaide and one of the most disadvantaged urban areas in Australia. Residents in that part of Adelaide received lower median weekly incomes than in Greater Adelaide. Almost 1/3 of Playford residents had a weekly personal income below the poverty line for a single person. At the 2011 census, the city's unemployment rate was almost double that of Greater Adelaide. The economic shock generated by the closure of the auto industry will be very large indeed in the absence of substantial offsetting investment. It will be made worse by prevailing economic conditions, particularly slower economic and employment growth rates flowing from the end of the mining investment phase of the recent commodity price-driven boom. More generally speaking, spending on major projects is set to fall, unfortunately, in the absence of new ones being approved. And that'll lead me later on in the talk to talking about some obvious strategic implications for how we might respond over the next months to come. The closure of the auto industry leaves a very large investment hole. The presence of the auto industry in South Australia has generated around about $1.6 billion per annum in economic activity, returning a sizable income in the form of taxes and charges and fees to both the state and federal government. Very little of the lost investment from the closure will be reinvested in South Australia or Australia because many of the large auto component suppliers are foreign-owned subsidiaries of multinational companies, and they really have no other reason to stay in Australia after the closure. Some companies will rationalise, others will pursue new markets. And there are a number of companies who have been expanding their operations, diversifying. There's good news, but not enough of it at this stage. The economic context in which the closure takes place has a profound bearing on the severity of the impacts of the closure. While total employment in South Australia has held up relatively well, given the global financial crisis and its devastating impact on other nations, short-term growth prospects are not all that favourable. While there's been a slight recent rise in employment vacancies, they are still 50% below their March peak. That is their March 2008 peak. Significant reductions in unemployment are unlikely in the lead up to the closure, leaving a legacy unemployment rate of around about 6%. But remember, this doesn't capture the wider problem of underemployment in South Australia. And at around 15%, the labour force underutilisation rate for November last year is very sobering. And in most areas impacted by the closure, unemployment rates are, of course, much higher. I should add that this is not a problem that affects the north of Adelaide, it also affects southern Adelaide profoundly because there's a large concentration of auto component suppliers in that part of Adelaide. While manufacturing remains one of the state's largest employers and will continue to be so in years to come, the reality is that we have lost around 30,000 jobs from the sector over the last 3 decades, even though there's been a bit of a tick up in manufacturing recently, which has been very welcome. So current manufacturing employment stands at around 86,000. I say that again, 86,000. I'd like to remind people that there are still lots of manufacturing jobs here in South Australia, and it is still one of the state's most significant employers, and parts of the manufacturing sector are growing. To put this in perspective, total employment in the mining sector has risen to around about 15,000, but unfortunately it's set to contract rather than expand over the short term. We won't get the much hoped for mining jobs boom until commodity prices improve or new cost-saving technologies make mining much more viable in locations like Olympic Dam. In the meantime, it's smart, however, to lay the foundations to capture the benefits of the next upswing in mining when it comes. Our largest and fastest growing sector is health and social assistance. Employment has doubled in the sector over the mid-1980s to around 110,000. But it's set to slow as a consequence of budget cuts at the federal level. Overall, workers losing their jobs in the auto sector have fewer opportunities to them than they had in the recent past, particularly in those sectors that they're best equipped to make the transition to. Some have argued that the growth in community services, health and ageing employment can fill the jobs gap. To some extent it will, but we have to acknowledge that knowledge and skills gained in the automotive industry are not readily transferable to the service sector. This is particularly a problem for some auto workers that have gained competencies on the job but don't have formal recognition of these. While recognition of these skills will help bridge this gap, significant retraining will ultimately be necessary in a lot of cases to make successful transitions to care-based jobs. It should be noted that much care-based employment also is casual and part-time, and it's also female-dominated, compared to the predominantly full-time employment in manufacturing, which is dominated by males. In the midst of all this uncertainty is the fear, of course, that the federal government will renege on the promise to build the next fleet of submarines in Australia, a very hot topic of the last few days. This would have involved construction and consolidation in South Australia in favour of imported vessels manufactured overseas. The prospect of both automotive and submarine manufacturing ceasing in South Australia is a very frightening one indeed. It represents somewhat of a perfect storm. Can we transition our industry, or are we doomed to deindustrialisation? I don't think so, and we need to do everything that we possibly can to ensure that that is not the case. But without a strategy for industrial diversification, the low road of reduced living standards does become a fait accompli. This is the logical outcome of a process of deindustrialisation once it sets in, takes hold, and is not adequately responded to. South Australia has a very short time to effect a transition to new manufacturing opportunities. The transition needs to be based in large part on core capabilities related to automotive, but not on building cars. It will be centred to a considerable degree on small and medium-sized enterprises. The strategy I propose is a high-value, high-skill, high living standards model of economic and social development. Let's call it a smart state strategy. It's about generating knowledge-intensive jobs in smart workplaces. We must be clear, particularly in light of the meagre support from the Commonwealth Government, that this is essentially a defensive strategy, particularly in the short to medium term. The central objective of the strategy would be to help retain core engineering, technology and organisational competencies that would be lost otherwise, and to retain these as the platform for longer-term industrial growth and rejuvenation. But there's no glossing over the fact that even if successfully implemented, such a strategy would not and could not compensate fully the scale of the losses in prospect from auto closure. A complementary package of short-term growth measures will be required to help fill the jobs hole created by the closure. And what specifically is the model of new manufacturing to which we wish to transition? We know that Australia will struggle to be competitive in forms of manufacturing where bases of competition remain scale of production and unit cost. The end of Australian auto manufacturing attests to the difficulties Australia faces in being a competitive manufacturer where scale and unit cost is king or queen. We cannot compete with China and India. But changes in technology and international supply changes, and what I mean by that, greater and greater specialisation and complexity, together with innovative business organisation, have opened up new opportunities for international competitive manufacturing based on short-run production, high variability, rapidity to market, and high-value products exhibiting medium to high complexity, that is, knowledge-intensive manufacturing. These changes have opened up opportunities for small and medium enterprises and clusters of these enterprises in increasingly specialised, interdependent global supply chains. This is what we mean by new manufacturing. New manufacturing involves the application of new technologies such as additive manufacturing or 3D printing. You'll have one in your house soon. They'll be as common as the iPad. Use of new materials such as titanium and graphene. It applies key enabling technologies such as photonics and nanotechnology. These are areas of research and development which I'm proud to say that my university, the University of Adelaide, has proven excellence. And they help to take us from scale and cost-based production, in which we have no future, into highly sophisticated, complex niche production through which we can avoid head-to-head competition with the industrial powerhouses to our north. Critically important for South Australia and the nation is alignment to new manufacturing. Is that alignment to new manufacturing means that small need no longer be a disadvantage. Examples abound of small, high-cost countries that have actively sought out and secured positions of international competitive advantage, moving up the value chain to compete less on cost, price factors, and more on agility and new manufacturing characteristics. These include Switzerland and the Scandinavian countries, Singapore and others. And I note in the Premier's opening to Parliament today that those models are referred to, and there'll be some effort devoted to looking at how we might apply some of those models here in South Australia, and that's very welcome. These countries sought to maintain and expand their involvement in manufacturing as central to their prosperity and their ability to participate in the global knowledge economy, rather than allow de-skilling and deindustrialisation. These countries recognise that building and sustaining positions of competitive advantage is about more than technology, as vital as that is, and includes a rigorous understanding of demand and global market and value chain opportunities, and the recognition of the critical role that non-price factors such as workplace innovation and sector-wide organisation and industrial strategy and policy play. Industry transformation and diversification must be front and centre of the response to the closure of the auto industry. What then of the response to date? Well, the state government responded early by establishing the Automotive Transformation Task Force, chaired by former Federal Industry and Innovation Minister Greg Combay. The task force is designed to support the transition of enterprises and workers into new areas of industry opportunity and to drive initiatives under the state's Our Jobs Plan suite of program. Now look, this is an excellent appointment and one that is respected across the political spectrum. I don't know if Greg's here today. I hope he is. He's very, very welcome. The task force is looking closely at how automotive component suppliers, mostly local-owned small and medium enterprises, can identify and then enter new product and market niches. It's also looking at the future of the Elizabeth plant. The state's Our Jobs Plan statement, released in January 2014, committed $60 million in state funds and sought, unfortunately unsuccessfully, a substantial package of assistance from the Commonwealth funding. At the time, some of you may remember that I was putting a fairly large number out there of $1 billion or so, which was a very large number. We didn't get it, but it was a bit of an ambit claim. And we're still arguing, of course, that there's a need for a much more substantial package of assistance to address the scale of the problem. And I hope that you might join us in that advocacy. And the substantial package of assistance in Our Jobs Plan focuses on assistance for displaced workers and their reskilling, support for affected communities through urban regeneration and related local projects, and automotive diversification program to help companies diversify, and so on and so on. There are a range of, I think, excellent initiatives contained in that. The state government has also committed $2 million over 4 years to the Stretton Centre in Playford as a local node of the proposed Innovative Manufacturing Cooperative Research Centre, which will be focusing on accelerated industry transformation through business model innovation, diversification into new value chains, building high-performance workplaces and so on. We wait with bated breath for the federal government to make some announcements in relation to this, and we very much hope that they are positive. These state responses, together with a manufacturing works suite of programs, are well-designed, world-class initiatives in my view. The problem with them is overwhelmingly that they are of insufficient scale to address the challenges comprehensively. This is a national problem. Substantial investment from the Commonwealth is necessary to tackle economic shocks of this scale, and very rarely in our history do we have the demise of an entire industry, particularly at a difficult time. An industry growth fund has been established as the Commonwealth Government's response to closure of the industry. Commonwealth resourcing of the growth fund is unduly modest, I have to say, with $101 million being contributed to it, with substantial contributions, I have to say, from the South Australian and Victorian state governments of around about 54 million. This is a far lower federal resource commitment than past responses, which, it should be noted, addressed smaller challenges at a time when overall economic conditions were much more favourable. The Growth Fund does include some useful initiatives: a regional infrastructure program, a next generation manufacturing investment program, an auto diversification program, and 2 programs focusing on skills training and jobs placement. It's not so much the focus as it is the scale of the programs, the investment that's necessary. The provision of these very modest funds in response to the closure of an entire industry needs also to be analysed against the Commonwealth Government's proposal to cut $900 million from the auto transformation scheme and to truncate the operational life of that scheme, which will hasten the closure, I have to say, of some automotive supply companies who were relying on the auto transformation scheme, and it will reduce time and opportunity for possible diversification by some of those companies into other product markets. And at this critical time, when the case for public investment in industry innovation and diversification is stronger than ever, the Commonwealth's stance has unfortunately been one of severe financial retrenchment or complete withdrawal in some cases, cutting then rather than redirecting funding for adjustment and industry diversification. They are reneging, have reneged on commitments to naval shipbuilding, although there's substantial movement in that debate, as I've said, and they're also downgrading their commitment to a range of other growth-promoting policies and programs. These policies and programs, long embraced by both major parties, typically cover skills, education and training, and promotion of industry transition, growth and innovation. Such policies and programs involve a cost, but they are justified on the basis that these costs are lower than the benefits they deliver through overcoming market failures, generating positive spillover benefits, cushioning the impact of shocks, such as the closure of the auto industry, or accelerating the transition of new knowledge-intensive activities. The Commonwealth claims that changes to industry support programs in the budget will result in streamlined, more efficient services. However, the centrepiece of this rationalisation, the Entrepreneurs Infrastructure Program, is funded just over half the level of the suite of programs it replaces, including Enterprise Connect, which is being cut quite significantly. The recent announced Industry Growth Centre initiative, whilst welcome, is nevertheless a revival of the previous industry precinct model, but again, unfortunately, at less than 1/5 of the previous level of funding. So that's the response to date. But what of the comprehensive, strategic, larger and smarter response that we need? There are clear international lessons and guides from regions that have fought back successfully against deindustrialisation, and here are a few. First, the need for an integrated plan of interdependent actions covering the short, medium and long terms, and covering any stimulus categories from industry diversification to infrastructure development to urban regeneration to health and ageing, amongst other areas. Now, these are covered in detail in a document called Strength and Diversity, which I and my colleagues and others have worked on in collaboration with the cities of Playford and Salisbury, with input from our colleagues in the state government as a submission to the Commonwealth inquiry into the auto closure in February last year. As I'm not going to be able to cover all the details of that report here, I commend the report to you. It's on the WISER website. But front and centre is industry diversification and transformation. This involves understanding opportunities within local and global supply chains aligned to the competences of local companies, those competences they already have or could acquire. Industry diversification can be achieved over the longer term, but it must start now. Understanding the demand drivers is a starting point. The strongest levers for industry diversification are on the demand side, and understanding of complex and interdependent supply chains in the international market is fundamental to understanding where we might grow. Technology is vital, but the strategy cannot be technology or supply push. That will not work. Amongst the complex value chains that should be mapped for local industry opportunities are some of the following. Select defence projects related to armoured vehicles and of course submarines. Sophisticated technology inputs to selected resources and energy projects such as copper and complex combined ore bodies and unconventional gas. Assistive technologies for older persons and people with a disability. Medical devices, the cellulose fibre chain and new construction materials and technologies such as cross-laminated timbers and fabricated buildings, prefabricated buildings I should say. Clean technologies including energy storage technologies, water technologies and so on. A whole value chain approach to expanding food and horticultural production. And applications of key enabling technologies in which South Australia is strong, such as photonics and sensing, visual technologies and advanced materials engineering, particularly titanium and graphene. An example here is the growing local and international assistive technology sector. It's a sector that designs, builds and services equipment and technologies to support independent living and healthy ageing. This is a growing multi-billion-dollar industry. Ageing both here and abroad will be the source of increasing demand for medical devices and assistive technologies, generating jobs and new businesses. This is the focus of one of our projects through the Stretton Centre, which is a project in partnership with the Department of State Development, and also with the Stuttgart-based Fraunhofer Gesellschaft, which is a major leader in this area and many other areas of accelerated industrial diversification. Accompanying several of these value chain target opportunities are propositions to develop advanced industrial precincts in Northern Adelaide. International evidence is that industry clusters and co-location of firms support higher growth. They support productivity, employment and innovation and help overcome issues of small scale. Industries and activities that agglomerate, that come together, have greater strength. And an observable element of successful industry growth is often the use of industry precincts and centres of competence. A good example of that here in Adelaide, a contemporary example of that, of course, is the Tonsley precinct development, something that's come a long way in a relatively short period of time. And one that I'm pleased to say is an international model at which we need to look at closely, having recently visited Birmingham and had a look at the Longbridge site where the former Rover MG company was based. And I have to say we're doing a lot better here in South Australia at the Tonsley plant at the Tonsley site than they are doing in Longbridge. While recovery from the collapse of the auto industry will take decades, action must be taken to help mitigate a multitude of negative impacts now. Patient long-term strategies need to be accompanied by job-rich short-term measures, measures that have wider industry and community development benefits associated with them. International and national experience suggests that we need to bring together two self-reinforcing policy agendas, and they are industrial rejuvenation and urban regeneration. Successful job-rich industrial rejuvenation involves the transformation of existing industries as well as the development of new and more resilient ones. In broad terms, it recognises the need to respond strategically and sometimes in transformational ways to structural and cyclical change. Innovation is often seen at the core of rejuvenation, necessitating the development of close and robust formal and informal linkages between government, industry, unions and the research community. Agile industry networks and clusters situated in a sophisticated regional innovation system are central to this challenge. Fortunately, many of the ingredients of this are already in South Australia. Urban and regional regeneration, on the other hand, entails the modernisation and revitalisation of ageing infrastructure, including housing stock. And again, I was very pleased to hear today that there will be a concerted effort to upgrade some of our oldest public housing here in South Australia. I believe about 2,400 houses are slated for modernisation and upgrade, which is very welcome. We might need to increase that number, but it's a very welcome initiative. Urban and regional regeneration, on the other hand, entails the modernisation and revitalisation of ageing infrastructure, including housing stock, transportation systems and civic spaces, creating healthy, stimulating and vibrant spaces to live, work and invest in. This is commonly regarded as a foundation for improving well-being and productivity, essential to building and sustaining successful and prosperous regional economies. During periods of crisis, urban regeneration can play a vital role in boosting domestic demand, creating alternative employment opportunities for those who lose their jobs through downsizing and closure. It also plays a vital role in boosting regional pride and morale. Linking urban and regional regeneration to industrial rejuvenation represents a significant conceptual, policy and practical challenge, one which we have considerable experience in, as I've said, with the Tonsley project and other projects here in South Australia. As I've said, we have some of the examples that we can build on here. We don't always necessarily have to look overseas, although I think there are many lessons that we can learn from the MG Rover experience and other measures elsewhere. We know from our experience during periods of recession and from the management of major company closures that it's vital that national, state and local policy be directed at bringing forward capital investment in productivity and amenity enhancing projects in regions affected by closure. International experience attests to the power of urban renewal and a focus on city revitalisation as a driver of industrial rejuvenation. In association with strategic and smart procurement practices, urban renewal can bring new products and innovation into being. Just consider the opportunities to use upgrades of the housing stock to introduce new smart home technologies, or to stimulate the growth of newer, better energy technologies, or of the potential to include new materials such as cross-laminated timbers in the construction of new public buildings. Imagine factory sites being used to build world-class modular prefabricated buildings. Finally, successful regions build regional innovation systems as the basis for their competitiveness. They build the intellectual and organisational assets and resilience of the region. This involves several elements, but especially promoting collaboration and networks between firms and industry clusters to build flexibility, capability and counter problems associated with small scale. Building innovation centres and precincts as focal points for industrial transformation. Having a strategic awareness of future opportunities and threats through value chain mapping and technology foresighting, and recognising that the most powerful factors are on the demand side. The Wade Institute, Roseworthy, the Theberton Bioscience Precinct, Mawson Lakes, Tonsley, Samri and the Stretton Centre are some of South Australia's existing high-value industry research extension institutions. While they do not yet cohere into a regional innovation system, they are critically important parts of a future regional system of innovation. The idea common to them is bringing people, resources and focus to a defined site of work on common or overlapping problems and opportunities. The missing ingredients are the right funding mechanisms and more deliberate attempts to create an innovation system for public benefit. International best practice tells us that the role of intermediary organisations is indispensable. These are organisations like Fraunhofer in Germany and VTT in Finland, and they work between researchers, government and industry, as translational and highly networked organisations. They are technically excellent, but they are just as exceptional on the non-technological elements of broader industry competitiveness, innovation, and high-performance enterprises. Innovation involves new technology platforms articulated to business model innovation and organisational innovation. These organisations, these translational institutions, work on the connections between the two. They work at the intersection between institutions. And that could be the glue that helps advance us much more fastly over coming years and that we so desperately need. They are knowledge rich and they provide knowledge brokerage. The objective in assembling these cross and multidisciplinary teams in one place is to accelerate learning, application and diffusion of technologies and high-performance production systems. In short, it's a form of action research. Such organisations hold technical knowledge, but that's not all. A very large part of their value to industry and to the community is the knowledge they hold on major trends about the future. That is, they build foresight into where global markets and technologies throw up challenges and opportunities. That in turn indicates where the region or the nation's industries need to be over the coming 5 to 10 years. It is probably in its understanding of this area where Australia and South Australia has lagged badly. This will be a specific area of the focus of the Stretton Centre, which is opening in June. And if perhaps one of my colleagues might be able to press the arrow key, we'll see a picture of the Stretton Centre in progress. So as of today, I'm pleased to say, a centre that will be opening in June. We hope to be a centre that provides just the glue between university, industries, government and the community to drive forward a world-class agenda on how we respond to major shocks like the auto closure, but more importantly, the diversification of our wonderful manufacturing sector here in South Australia. Our ambition is for the Stretton Centre to play a leading integrative and collaborative role in South Australia's industrial rejuvenation in partnership with government, industry and the wider community. In so doing, we want to help integrate and bring together more of those players in our regional innovation system. In conclusion, I hope that I've convinced you that manufacturing matters. It matters to our prosperity and also to our strength and fairness as a community. I also hope that you're persuaded of the need for a much more substantial investment by the federal government tackling the impacts of the closure, particularly the need to boost investment in enterprise transformation and infrastructure expenditure simultaneously. If the right actions are taken now, we can avoid escalating unemployment and growing hardship in our hardest hit suburbs. Recognising that we need to act boldly and decisively is the starting point. We cannot afford to wait and see what transpires from the closure of the industry. Thank you. I understand there's time for questions. A little bit of time. Sorry.
Thank you, John. I realise that we've just run slightly over time, and for those of you who have to leave, please go. But I'd just like to take, and I'm sure John will be happy to have people come up and ask him questions afterwards, but I'll just take two quick questions if you have them.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. A question about the bleeding obvious. Why don't we just process more of the materials we dig out of the ground here in Australia?
It is one of those questions that's at the forefront, I think, of a lot of people's minds. Why do we add value to a lot of things, the things that we process and things that we grow? And I think that's critically important. One area I mentioned, which we could talk a lot about, I think, that has enormous prospects in the absence of commodity prices not driving a mining boom is, of course, horticulture. And we have some incredibly, I think, vital and important companies in Northern Adelaide and the Northern Adelaide Plains, and some of those are very well positioned to, with the right sort of support, to accelerate the growth of value-adding horticulture in Northern Adelaide. So I agree with your your question, your statement.
One more question.
Thank you. Car is not a product of the future. Renewable energy is. Therefore, we need sensible policies promoting public transport and cycling, and to shift some of the jobs to these sectors of transportation. And new jobs that we need to create in Australia that I see, even though it's not my area of expertise. Technologies of recycling and recovery of materials that can be exported. Environmental technologies to clean up air, water, ocean, whatever, that can be exported. And above all, developing technologies to produce renewable energy that can be exported on top of being sold to our population. Thank you.
No, thank you. I'm sure many people here would share your sentiments about the importance of a renewable energy sector and sustainability as a driver of economic and employment opportunities over the next 10, 20, 30 years. I've just come back from the United Kingdom and Germany, and it's obvious to me that that agenda is being very aggressively pursued. One of the world's largest companies, Siemens, is positioning itself to be the provider of just those sorts of goods and services across the globe. You know, their strategy is built fundamentally on that premise, the premise that you are outlining, that this is an enormous opportunity for us. Of course, China is very aggressively pushing into this space at the moment, and we would do well to send the right sort of signals to companies here in Australia and South Australia to accelerate the growth of sustainable industries, sustainable jobs and renewable energy technologies. South Australia could be a real leader in it, and it has in many ways in respect to showing the way. Of course, we have one of the largest installed wind farm technologies. Although we didn't exploit the full potential of that from an industrial employment development point of view, we could do so with other technologies over the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, John, I can't think of an issue that's more important for our community, and you've covered it absolutely superbly. And we have a little thank you gift here. You'll never guess what it is.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you.
And would you all join me in thanking John for his presentation?